Okay,
Oh, perfect. All right.
sorry about that.
everybody.
And so now we have these slides.
Now we-
And one thing that happened is we put together about a 2-hour workshop, and we're going to do it really quickly. So jump in with any questions. We're going to go through a lot of things. What we wanted to do in this is focus on some evidence-based methods that have been demonstrated to reduce equity gaps. And so first, maybe?
Yeah, so, first, in thinking about equity gaps, it can, be equity gaps across race and ethnicity. It can be gender, income, first generation status. I think, we often are thinking about the identities that our students have and share with each other. And, certainly a lot of these do overlap. And so when we're thinking about equity gaps, it's important to think about, in what ways are we hoping to close these equity gaps, because they, are, all very important parts of our students' identities. So some of the research on equity gaps, if we're looking at this graph here, it's showing graduation rates from first institution attended for the first time for full-time bachelor degree seeking students at 4-year post-secondary institutions, right? So we can see that, for our white students.
Sorry to interrupt. We're not seeing the slides.
Oh, no.
Oh,
Okay. Someone has gotten really out of practice. You took over and I lost it. Okay. There we go. We now have the slides back.
Thank you.
John, it's also hard to hear.
Really?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't hear Maggie.
Okay.
Oh, well, let's make sure it's coming from the right thing. Maggie,
Yeah,
say something.
can you hear me okay?
That's a little bit better.
Use this microphone. We've got 6 microphones here.
Yeah,
One of them.
we've got a lot of microphones. Is this better?
Much better.
Awesome. Okay, then I will shift to this seat. So yeah, first, we wanted to just kind of show what those equity gaps look like. And, so this was some research done, published, with the U.S. Department of Education on graduation rates. And, if we're looking at that second column, which shows white students, 45% of white students are graduating within 4 years, and we see a vast difference for Black and Hispanic students, right at 21% and 32% within 4 years. And even when we're looking at graduation rates within 6 years, there's certainly a vast gaps between the graduation rates among students of various race and ethnic backgrounds. And so, part of implementing these effective teaching practices to address equity gaps is with the intention that we can shift some of these outcomes for all of our students.
So one of the things we can do, and this is something we talked about in the reading group this fall that many people I know here participated in, is to work on building more of a sense of community. And one aspect of it is humanizing the instructor and giving students more of a sense of the humanness of the instructor to help form those relationships. That was also part of the reading group this spring when we were talking about relationship-rich education. Some of the best things you can do, or some of the simplest things you can do, is first to learn the names of your students and also the pronunciations of the names, because it does create much more of a bond with students if they know that you know their names. It's a fairly simple thing to do, but it's helpful. So practicing the names, getting audio recordings of the names if possible, especially if if you don't know how to pronounce it, or asking students how to pronounce a name, or using name tags if you're not very good at remembering names, or you have a larger class, could be helpful. Another thing that's really helpful is we didn't proofread this apparently. We could arrive early and also stay late. That those conversations at the beginning of class, informal ones at the beginning or the end of the class, can be really helpful. when students are working in groups or working on activities, wander around the classroom a bit and chat with them and talk to them and offer assistance and just see how they're doing. Um, and our reading group, I don't remember, was it this year or last year, where we talked, I was in the fall, one of the things that was talked about is using the who's in class form, or doing some type of a survey to get to know something about your students, find out what their interests are, and try to connect examples from their interests to what you're talking about in class. And also provide students with some plan about how and when you are available. If you're not going to be available on weekends or at evenings, let them know that so they won't be sitting there at the computer waiting an immediate response. But telling them how best to contact you and when also helps make communications a little more effective.
So, for kind of thinking about building community and that instructor-student relationship, I just wanted to highlight that, discovering student interests doesn't necessarily mean that you have to, get on TikTok and, get,
And do a dance.
and do a dance and, do some choreography and all of that. But, really just giving the opportunity for students to, talk about their days. One thing that, talk about their lives and, what's important to them in that moment or, broadly. One of the things that I've done with my students this past semester, which I again can't take credit for because it was a suggestion made in a reading group earlier this term, was to just start class by asking students, what are 3 good things going on today? And, sometimes it would take a little while for students to, really get comfortable saying something, but I would give that time and that space, for them to just share with myself, with each other, what's going on, what's important to them. And sometimes it would be, students sending me pictures of their dogs so that I could share them with the class. And, so there's, just kind of creating that space for that community building with you and your students is so important. And so, kind of building on that, thinking about how we facilitate students engaging with each other. So some of the ways we can, create that inclusive environment is by using cooperative or team-based learning activities, whether you are assigning those groups randomly or using some kind of neutral criteria to sort students, right? So making sure that those student groups don't become segregated for any particular reason, but also making sure that students are rotating those responsibilities within discussion groups are, another important way to ensure equity in the classroom. Providing students with multiple means of expression. So making sure that you are varied with your assessments and activities so that students have lots of different ways that they can express their learning and express their engagement with each other. Peer instruction activities are also important for facilitating those student-to-student relationships. Encouraging students to get to know each other. So one thing that I require my students to do is that when they, are building off of conversations with each other, that they turn to the person that they are talking to or the person that they've decided to build on, their conversation and address them by name so that they're learning each other's names. Most of those students, and, I'm talking in this moment about my current teaching, which is senior seminar class, and they've taken classes with these students over and over again. They know who they are, but they don't know their names, right? And it certainly there are friends within the class, beforehand, but it's really, I think, such an awesome, environment when you can really encourage them to get to know each other on a human level. It makes having difficult conversations a bit easier when you're humanizing, your classmate, and you're not just saying, well, I don't agree with what that person said. You're saying, what, Kayla said really stood out to me, and this is why, and to, really kind of facilitate that engagement with each other. Using inclusive discussion strategies. So using small groups, I mentioned before, making sure you rotate who reports and records. Research, right, has told us, John can chime in too, that, often the responsibilities of recording and note-taking fall to women. And, there's a lot of, equity concerns in engagement and learning outcomes when, that kind of gendered expectations are kind of, are not facilitating, but they're driving the different ways that students are engaging.
And in terms of the mix of groups, having balanced groups is good, and using random assignment can be good, but you may want to do a little bit of tweaking, because there is at least some research that suggests when you have female minority groups, then when there's self-assessments, both the female students and their peers tend to rate their participation lower when they're in a minority in that group. But when we have even groups or female majority groups, we don't see that same sort of bias. And males do not get harmed when they're in a minority in terms of their own rating of their participation or their peers rating from either gender. So, you don't want to have, if groups may be perhaps underrepresented in a discipline, having groups where those individuals are in a minority may tend to suppress their participation in small group activities. And right now there's some research going on with race, but we do have pretty strong evidence in terms of gender, in terms of the mix. And one of the things I'd like to emphasize about peer instruction is that students come into our classes and our institutions with really unequal backgrounds in terms of the quality of the education, the quantity of education, the quality of instruction they've received, and so forth. And peer instruction is a really great leveling force. And if you have balanced teams where you have some people in each group or in the activities with really strong knowledge and students with weaker knowledge, we can really leverage that to help close that gap. The students who already know some of the concepts pretty well reinforce and deepen their knowledge by explaining it to others. And the students who have not had the same exposure or the same opportunity to learn these material, some of the content earlier, can gain a lot by listening to their peers explain it, because peers are often able to express things in ways that are much, when they're at a similar level of cognitive development, are able to explain it more effectively than we can. There is that thing called the curse of knowledge, as it's often been phrased, that when you really know something, it's hard to understand what people don't understand. But with peer instruction, that tends to be closed pretty nicely. So using peer instruction has been shown in many, many studies to be really effective in terms of closing equity gaps.
So, kind of continuing on, making sure that your course material and that your course design is using inclusive examples, avoiding, practices that may create stereotype threats. So things like equity walks. I think John knows a little bit of the research on using those kind of practices, right? But things that are potentially exposing students to the idea that they are fulfilling some kind of stereotype that is generally attributed to identities that they hold.
If you're not familiar with the equity walk activity, basically what you do is you have a group of students and then you ask them whether they had attended, whether they participated in various clubs or organizations, how large their home was, where their income of their parents was in some cases.
Did they have a 2-income household, or did they
then they step
attend
forward
summer
if they
camps?
do that, and it segregates students basically according to how much privilege they have. And many people were doing that as a way of demonstrating inequity, but it tends to reinforce stereotype threat, and it's probably not a very good thing to do.
Right.
We should also note that Kristen Croyle had noted in the chat that students with different academic backgrounds bring really different skill, a different mix of skills to the group. And as part of this, emphasizing that all the students are bringing in their own unique skills and perspectives, and that we can benefit from what everyone brings to the group, and emphasizing that can be really helpful, and they can demonstrate those skills within the small group activity, much more so than in larger group activities where they may feel a bit marginalized.
Absolutely. Another thing, to consider is decolonizing your curriculum. So, again, thinking about how your discipline and how, decisions about what is important in your field's content, how that is being shaped by, typically people who hold a lot of privilege in society and hold a lot of privilege within your discipline, and really, thinking about highlighting those perspectives of marginalized groups and underrepresented groups, and making that clear to students that you are intentionally doing that, right, is an important part of representation. And then, of course, having students provide their own examples. So allowing them to use their lived experiences and amplify their voices in order to create this inclusive environment.
And you can give assignments where one of the activities is just to say, where have you observed this in your own life or in your own experiences, just to create those sort of connections, to show the richness that our students are bringing or bringing to the discussions.
Yeah, and I know for my classes that tend to deal with kind of difficult topics, and asking students about their lived experiences may invite different kind of disclosures or things that students may not be comfortable with. So I always ask them, to talk about anything real or not, right? So they can look to media and other things that may still give them an opportunity to talk about how their experiences or what they've viewed in their lives have contributed to this conversation, but also takes the pressure off of putting the onus on students to disclose any sort of information they may find sensitive to share.
So growth mindset, we've been talking about this in lots of things.
Yes.
Kristen did a workshop yesterday that focused on this. We
Wonderful
put this
workshop.
together before that, and we didn't take it out because it is kind of important. So encouraging students to develop a growth mindset, basically to let students know that you learn from mistakes, that making mistakes is an important part of learning, and that's how learning takes place in any discipline, and emphasizing that is really helpful. But encouraging students to recognize this and developing your course in such a way that builds that in, and being transparent about it, letting students know they're going to make mistakes, but that's how they learn. So that notion of fail forward, which is a term that's come up a lot in our discussions with the reading groups. Also, you can talk about times when you learn from your mistakes, and that's a really good way of helping students accept the fact that we all make mistakes, and that it's not a sign that they're not able. It's just a sign of normal development cognitively or in the discipline. Using low stakes or no stakes assessment, where students can make mistakes without any penalty or with very little penalty, and giving them the opportunity for revision is really helpful, so that they recognize that they can try things, and if they don't do it correctly, they can do it better the next time. And reminding them of how they learn sports or other things that when they first tried riding a bicycle, they probably didn't hop on it and do a 5-mile ride. And similarly with any other activity, that it's a normal part of learning. But that's not the experience that most students have had as they've been going through school. And so encouraging them to develop a growth mindset, the research shows, is really, really important. And one example of that was provided in a podcast we did with Angela Bauer a couple of years ago, who worked on improving growth mindset both at Green Bay and at High Point in North Carolina. And in her most recent, the experiment she did at High Point, in biology classes, she shared with all the introductory biology classes just a PowerPoint slide that emphasized growth mindset every week. So all the instructors used that and talked about that for just a few minutes at the start of every class. And the racial equity gap completely disappeared after introducing that, when it was fairly large before in biology. So we don't always get results at large, but a focus on growth mindset in many, many studies have been really helpful. And also, this came up in a discussion yesterday as well, faculty mindset matters quite a bit as well. And we do have a couple of podcasts with Elizabeth Canning, who was the author of a couple studies that showed that if faculty do not have a growth mindset, that tends to increase equity gaps. And it's much better to work on developing. It's much more productive if we can develop a positive attitude and recognize that students can learn, and that if we go into the class believing that some students are going to be successful and some aren't, that's going to happen.
Right.
But we probably don't want that to happen. So,
And I think, if you didn't catch Kristen's workshop yesterday, correct me if I'm wrong, Kristen, on, the good ideas for your syllabus presentation, one of the, she talked a lot about the research on equity gaps and how, having growth mindset language in a syllabus, that there's a lot of research that shows we can start to close some of those equity gaps just in the way that we phrase our course design, and the way we communicate that to students. And so there's kind of small things that we can do that are, very easy, kind of simple changes that can carry on from semester to semester, that can really help close these gaps.
and a simple thing is not talking about the rigor in your course.
Right.
Focus on challenge, because students respond pretty well to a challenge, but the term rigor tends to discourage people, and it conveys this message of weeding out, and that's not what we'd like to do.
Yeah.
So,
what matters, right? So when we're thinking about, closing equity gaps, really we can look to a lot of our effective evidence-based teaching strategies to help address these gaps. So things like retrieval practice, spaced practice, interleaved practice. John has a lot of experience with metacognitive reflection. So thinking about the way we think are all, evidence-based ways we can reduce equity gaps and promote effective learning in our classrooms. And this can be done right through adaptive learning, personalized learning, mastery learning. So we can think about, kind of the motivations of using these practices is not just to, have effective learning in our classroom, but also, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative as well.
and the adaptive learning and personalized learning, I advocate in many, many places. It can, because there are platforms available, often based on OER textbooks, that build in many of these things, that will build in retrieval practice, that will build in some space practice, and will often build in some interleave practice. And if a student gets to interact with those materials, computers don't get tired of providing feedback, and that's a really good way of closing equity gaps. And the research on that is really, really strong, that in many cases, the use of an adaptive learning or something like Women Learning's personalized learning system will, if not eliminate equity gaps, it for Pell eligible students and by race, and well, pretty much the research is on Pell eligibility and race. And those gaps, if they don't completely disappear, end up being reduced to a fraction of what they were before. And again, it's a really nice way of doing this without imposing more costs on the instructor in terms of providing support for students to basically make up for some of the differences that we see in what students have learned prior to coming to our institutions.
And John, let me know if I'm putting my foot in my mouth, but I'm pretty sure Brightspace kind of allows us to do some of that personalized feedback with agents.
With agents, yes.
And, so there's, some other tools we'll be able to dive into later this summer and, throughout all of next year when we hold workshops that we can kind of talk about how we might use some new tools available to us to make this.
You can, in
personalized.
Brightspace, you have the opportunity of providing customized feedback for students based on how they do on specific assessments. So you could, for example, open up some support and resources for students if they score below a certain thing and suggest they use that before going back and attempting it again, or you could leave it open for everyone. But you can also provide feedback based on how they are doing on particular assessments, congratulating them on their success or, on how well they've done. Or you could say you need to work on this a bit more and then directing them to specific resources. And we have, with the replacement strings available, we can personalize that. So there can be emails going out to students with their names embedded on it, with their scores embedded in it and so forth. And that's a feature we're getting back after having been stuck with Blackboard for quite a few years now. So I'm very much looking forward to it. It's already working in my summer class.
All right, so another thing that we don't often think about when we are designing our courses to be equitable and thinking about the ways we can reduce equity gaps are thinking about resource scarcity. I think we talked a bit about this. I think the provost was highlighting a bit about this in our student success symposium. About just the financial stress that a lot of our students are going through, and maybe I'm actually misremembering who was talking about that specifically, but resource scarcity is something that can really impact the way our students are able to engage with our course material and their cognitive performance. So whether that stress is caused by financial or food insecurity, which we know a lot of our students are really struggling with. And I think some of that research that we saw on Monday showed that, in some ways our students are, much higher than the national average in having food insecurity and financial insecurity. And so some of the things that, we can do to kind of address these gaps in our classrooms is delaying purchasing textbooks. So not expecting students to have, the materials for your course that very first day of class. A lot of students who rely on financial aid and various supports for obtaining course materials don't get that ability to purchase those materials with financial aid until later into the term.
So the students who are coming in with the weakest backgrounds in terms of their prior educational preparation often get a really late start in classes. And by the time they get the textbooks and other things they need, they've fallen so far behind, they're not going to be successful. And providing students with that first day access is essential.
And so, other ways to, think about making your courses more equitable is to use OER or open pedagogy materials. If not, using kind of a digital direct access, like John was mentioning, that allows students to have access to their material within the very first time that they get into the class. Providing students with resources on services for mental health, food insecurity, and other support. We have some really good programs on campus. We have SHOP, which is students helping Oz peers, I believe, and that provides students and faculty, right, with food, pantry items, personal items that they may be struggling to obtain on a regular basis that they need. And so there are some really good programs on campus. And so, being able to tell students that you acknowledge that this is a problem and that this is, a issue that you care about and that you are concerned about, and then giving them the resources and tools to access these services is so important.
Jessamine.
Well, I just keep thinking, and I can't get the question out of my mind, so I'm hoping to tap into the brain trust that's here from the teaching center and also from faculty. Yeah, I can't help but think of a number of faculty on my campus who I don't seem to care about these issues, and let alone like how to fix them. And I'm just wondering, like, what kind of, I know there's no magic wand, but it like a kind of information or approach that anyone here in this meeting, either, as a faculty member or a facilitator of pedagogical learning, found was a way to help, I guess, raise awareness of the problems with equity gaps before the possible means of mitigating them.
One thing that I keep thinking of is that these equity gaps became incredibly obvious when we went remote, when every instructor saw that some of their students were having difficulty accessing their courses by Zoom, where they did not have adequate Wi-Fi, where they had many people crowded into the room so they couldn't participate in discussions because they were in a room crowded with their siblings, or they were engaged in childcare responsibilities or other things, or they were trying to connect on an old smartphone that just did not work as well as it did for other students. And I think it would be incredibly difficult to have ignored that then. But it's really easy for people to start forgetting that. So, I mean, one thing we can do is keep reminding people of those differences, because on campus, those things are hidden. When students are in the classroom, they have access to the campus Wi-Fi, they have computer labs and so forth, and we do have meal plans and support services. But that doesn't change the students' lives when they're outside of the classroom or in general in terms of the other stresses. Reminding faculty as much as possible of what was observed, I think, is the only thing we can do.
Well, and I think, we've also talked about, and there seems to be a pilot initiative, and, hopefully it becomes larger and more accessible for faculty, but thinking about, kind of, I mean, certainly, I guess not necessarily related to scarcity, but thinking about like dashboards for individual classes so that, faculty can start to recognize that, oh, there are gaps in my classroom in terms of, opportunity gaps for for my students, and, how might I start to address that? Because, I think, in a lot of ways, faculty need to get, kind of hit over the head with this, to, realize that, oh yeah, this is not just a problem that this one student brought up, but this is what, in terms of food scarcity, I think it was, a good third, or it was, I don't remember the numbers, but it was a significant proportion of our students have reported being food insecure. And maybe even severely food insecure. And, just having those numbers is like, it's scary for me as an instructor to think that my students are coming to class hungry. And, of course, there is that selection bias, right? The people who are attending and receiving these information are often the ones who, very much care about these issues. So in my, thoughts, I'm like, we need the shop representatives, going into department meetings, and we need, that kind of awareness spread in different ways. We certainly try, but it is hard to, it is hard to access the people who probably do need to, be thinking about how their courses are impacted by this and how they are impacting their students by their practices.
And that issue of dashboards is something that is really, really helpful. If faculty could see a breakdown of how their students are doing based on race, by gender, by Pell eligibility, and so forth, it would make it much harder to ignore these issues. And, if we don't, it's easy to ignore data that doesn't exist,
right?
Other than in studies that are done. But if those reports were shared, and we've been pushing for that here for quite a few years, and we haven't made much progress, but there seems to be at least some discussion of that with the ASCU work that our institution is working on, because that's one of the major things they push.
Yeah.
UNC Chapel Hill has done a really good job with that, and it's made some really dramatic differences.
Yeah, Kate, did you want to?
I was just gonna say how Maggie mentioned that they could go to department meetings.
Mhm.
I haven't been going to them long. I'm a new VAP, but I've been to a couple now, and we did have a student from the School of Business that visited and gave a presentation about how this clubs are really hurting and for participation, and asking us to encourage our students, let them know about them, maybe even provide some extra credit for it. And it's already come up like several times, like how he came and talked to us, and let's try to do that more. And so I do think that would be an effective way to inform the rest of our campus.
Hearing it from students can be really effective.
Right.
I know.
And I think we saw that on Monday, a lot of faculty had feedback on, how important it was to really keep students at the center and included in these conversations.
But not everybody goes to that, but we do go to department meetings because it's required.
Yeah,
so we're there,
so I think that is an untapped resource that is often.
I thought it was highly effective.
I think something that I like to do that I think of as the annoying method is just being really persistent and being an ally and bringing these things up whenever there is any kind of related discussion. Like if you think there's something being discussed where people aren't considering these equity gaps, bring it up every time, over and over. And then for me, this can work in that people will start to think, I can't stand to hear her say that another time, so I'm going to start thinking about it myself. So in a way, it's being an ally in education but I like to think of it in a more
More of a
persistent way.
grassroots.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we'll provide some opportunities
we
to bring up
will.
some more examples forward. But one thing I did want to mention, well, Kristen noted that we do have a group of faculty who passively care but don't know how to approach it, and regularly pushing resources out can be helpful. One thing I noted, because I've been doing some work with some people at GCC recently,
Mhm.
one of the things they've done in their Brightspace instance is they put in a module in their course, or they put in as a common module in every single course for every single student, a set of resources in the Brightspace shell that shares link to food service, that
Mhm.
food support for,
That would be great. Yeah.
for gender
Counseling
issues,
services or
for
whatever.
Yeah.
transportation services, as
Right.
well as for mental health services.
Yeah.
So that is pushed out to everybody, which is a really good way of approaching it.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we've got a couple more things. So, in terms of course design, making sure you provide a lot of structure in your courses. So when you are creating assignments, that you are scaffolding assignments, you are allowing each assignment to be built upon a previous assignment. You're providing regular and very clear feedback at each stage, making sure that your instructions are clear, using examples of past work. And so, I think it's also just as important to show students what, average work looks like as well, so that, you're not just providing your A students, the papers that, belong to A students, but also ones that, belong to B and C and so forth. And, just thinking about how, and I've also thought about how, showing students not only like what those final products looked like, but what it looked like in those earlier scaffolded stages and how it transformed into that final project. So that's another good way to close some equity gaps.
And if you don't want to ask students for low quality work to share with others, if you could do it anonymously, you could create some yourself. And
Sure.
that's something that Ken Bain has used to help improve the quality of writing in this class. And what he did is he gave students examples of A work, B work, or C or lower
Yeah.
level work. And he had them meet in groups to determine what made it
Mhm.
high quality work, or
Yeah.
medium quality, or low quality work. And they use that to create rubrics to evaluate it. But it gave students the opportunity to think about what
Right.
really represented high quality work. And that sort of engagement can be really useful.
Yeah, especially if you're teaching a class for the first time, to
Mhm.
create those examples yourself. Active learning in most studies shows that we are increasing learning for all students. So it's not a benefit that only exists for students who are coming from high achieving backgrounds, but that the gains are really generally largest for our first gen students. It can be the case that students are not very excited about active learning techniques, but explaining to them and being transparent to them about why we're doing certain activities in the classroom can be a really big help in buy-in for those activities.
And in many cases, this will eliminate or close equity gaps. Cornell has done a lot of research on it with their active learning initiative, but so have many other institutions. Carl Wyman has done some studies on this. Now, we have a resource here. If you have a list of resources, you could take a picture of this and it should open up a Google Drive file. So this has resources for many of the things we've talked about, with some of the original studies, some podcasts that we've recorded with some of the people who've done some of the research on this.
Mhm.
Is that
Yeah,
working
there's
for
a
everyone?
lot. Yeah, it's working for me. Yep, it works for all of you.
And we also have put together a Jamboard. And again, if you take a picture of that, you can go there, and this will exist after this session. And I will also put that in chat. Well, maybe I won't.
Okay, I am old, I don't know what Jamboard.
So Jamboard's like a whiteboard,
whiteboard.
but it's digital. So you can make notes and everyone will see it, but it's anonymous, which is really nice because you can have your students, if you want them to share like stickiest points or, something that they feel like they need more understanding on, you can do this like anonymously so they can share with the class. So it's a really nice tool that I've just really learned about since John has showed me. And so
And we put
it's
things
cool.
here for people to share. Save the link for this. You can go back and add some new things. And we have techniques for building community, strategies you can use to provide a more inclusive curriculum. And a good thing to do, by the way, is just search for decolonizing psychology classes or decolonizing history classes or economics. You don't find as much in economics, it turns out. But if you search for that, you can often find some really good resources that people have adopted. Techniques of fostering a growth mindset, some ways of implementing evidence-based techniques. And again, the use of these things, emphasizing retrieval practice, space practice, interleave practice, and having students reflect on what they've learned have all been shown to increase learning for everyone, but even more so for the students who tend to get left behind.
And, I'll just say that, in terms of like interleaving and retrieval practice, doing low stakes quizzes are really great for this, especially if you set up your course banks, your test banks in your LMS, to, provide certain questions for each chapter, right? And then you can add in questions that are coming up in the next chapter, and you can, there's some really cool ways that you can kind of facilitate interleave practice and retrieval practice in, in the LMS, and using some of the activities that we often use, regularly for evaluative assessment.
Okay, so I put in the link for the Jamboard, but I will put in one to the resources as well. Oops, I didn't press return there. There we go. So this is the resource link. But use the Jamboard, and on the Jamboard, the easiest thing to do is to add a sticky note. And so if we go to that Jamboard, all you need to do if you want to add something is just click on the sticky note over here and type something, and then move it wherever you want. You can resize it, you can rotate it. If you're really obsessive, you can make them all the same size and line them up in a nice little grid. There's always someone who ends up doing that on some of the pages. If you're not, you can, put it wherever you want, but just type something here and add it. So I'll just put in this one as a sample, and we'll click save.
Boo. Pink.
You can change it by just clicking on it, and you can make it pink.
all kinds of colors.
You can grab it and you can rotate it if you want. You can make it bigger or smaller. You can change the color, the font, you can type things on it. Do whatever you'd like with it, but it's a really nice way of sharing resources. And it's a great teaching technique too. If you want to get feedback from students right away, put up the QR code. They can all access it from their phones. If they're participating remotely, drop it into chat and they can use it there. But I'm not seeing a lot of participation yet.
Well, if anyone wants to, throw in some ideas, or, if they want to share, because we are at our time.
Yeah.
But, if anyone wants to kind of share some of the things that they do in the classroom, or some things they, are interested in doing, we'd love to hear it in a minute.
And a nice thing is it's anonymous. So students can use this without feeling any pressure in terms of revealing their issues. So if you want to talk about,
They
for
can ask
example,
questions.
they
too,
can
right?
ask
Even,
questions.
Like a lot of kids
They can
don't
type
ask
out a question.
students don't ask
Absolutely.
questions, 'cause I think
It's
those
also a really
good
quick
ones.
way of
Right.
getting some feedback on how the class is going, you know?
Librarians love Jamboards, so have good experiences with
And
them.
it's built into our Google Apps. So
Yeah, it's a really nice tool. All right, a couple of people have to leave us, but any thoughts, any last
any questions or suggestions?
other than we should have made this an hour and 20-minute presentation, clearly, but
No, I don't really have any comments there. Not really have to revamp everything.
Yeah.
well, I think another
Little
important
changes.
point, right, is making little changes. And again, I really liked Kristen's seminar yesterday on the syllabus, because it is something where, like, you just spend 20 minutes and use that language in all the rest of your classes.
One thing, by the way, if you do use a Jamboard, make sure you make it public and that you allow anyone to edit it, because otherwise students will join and will only be able to see it, because by default, you only share a view,
I
the
see.
ability to
Right.
view it. So give everyone edit rights and just share it publicly. And that way they can log in without having to they can use it without logging in.
Excellent
Do you
point.
leave it up so that they
I leave it up and anyone can use this at any
answer
time, so
class and stuff? Like,
yes.
when they're studying and stuff, or?
you can. Mhm.
Yeah. And you can drop the links to them in your LMS so that they can go back and look at them. And, so, even if you're working on it in class, you can, create that, the opportunity for them to go back to it at another point. But yeah, so, I think like closing equity gaps feels like it's a huge task, right? Because they are so clearly present in all courses, right? Even if we don't have that dashboard material, right? Where we can see our course level data and what those equity gaps look like, we can assume that basically every class has, some problems with equity gaps. And it does feel like there's a huge amount of things that we can do, but, I think I want to encourage everyone to, pick some things now and, and when the time is right, when you feel like you can keep moving forward, there are a lot of different ways.
Tom Tobin often talks about the +1 strategy. Just
Yes.
try one new thing.
Yeah, one new thing. And I think that does make it feel more manageable,
Yeah.
than like totally revamping a course every single semester. And so,
We will stop the recording.
excellent.